Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Welcome to Cineversary, a new podcast that celebrates a milestone anniversary of a cinematic classic. Every month we wish a happy birthday to a different film currently observing a joyous jubilee, everything from a 20th to a 100th anniversary. I'm your host, Erik Martin, creator and moderator of the Cineverse Film Discussion Group that meets weekly in the Chicagoland area. This month we salute the 50th anniversary of a groundbreaking film, Midnight Cowboy, directed by John Schlesinger. And like any good birthday party, we invite special guests to partake in the commemoration. This time around, I'll be joined by Niles Schwartz, a movie reviewer for Slant Magazine, co-founder of the Minneapolis St. Paul Cinephile Society, and author of the book Off the Map, Freedom, Control, and the Future in Michael Mann's Public Enemies. Together, we'll talk about why Midnight Cowboy is worth celebrating all these years later, its cultural impact and legacy, what we can learn from the picture today, how it stood the test of time, and more. Before I introduce Niles, however, here's some context on this month's movie. According to Wikipedia, Midnight Cowboy is a 1969 American buddy drama film. Based on the 1965 novel of the same name by James Leo Herlihy, the film was written by Waldo Salt, directed by John Schlesinger, and stars Jon Voight and Dustin Hoffman, with notable smaller roles being filled by Sylvia Miles, John MacGyver, Brenda Vaccaro, Bob Balaban, Jennifer Salt, and Barnard Hughes. Set in New York City, Midnight Cowboy depicts the unlikely friendship between two hustlers, naive prostitute Joe Buck, played by Voight, and alien conman Ratso Rizzo, personified by Hoffman. The picture was distributed by United Artists originally on May 25, 1969. Its original budget was $3.2 million, but its box office gross tallied over $44.8 million. The film won 3 Academy Awards: Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Adapted Screenplay. Midnight Cowboy is the only X-rated film ever to win Best Picture, although such a classification no longer exists, and it was also the first gay-related Best Picture winner. It has since been placed 36th on the American Film Institute's list of the 100 greatest American films of all time, and placed 43rd on its 2007 updated version. In 1994, Midnight Cowboy was deemed culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant by the Library of Congress and selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry. It currently holds a 90% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes, where it's also earned an average critical rating of 8.3 out of 10. To set the scene, here's audio from the original trailer.
I'm Joe Buck from Texas.
Enrico Rizzo from the Bronx.
And I'm gonna buy you a drink. What the hell do you think of that?
Oh, I don't mind if I do.
Why do you think I come all the way up here from Texas for? Well, I'm a hustler. You didn't know that?
You were gonna ask me for money? Huh?
Will you get out of here?
You gotta get yourself some kind of management.
Only the echo.
I'm walking here. I'm walking here.
Don't worry about that. Actually, that ain't a bad way to pick up insurance, you know. In New York, no rich lady with any class at all buys that cowboy crap anymore.
Women like me, goddammit. Hell, the only one thing I've ever been good for is loving.
But for that service, I charge $20. I happen to be his manager.
Okay.
I'll buy his coffee, huh, please? I don't think I can walk anymore. You know what they do to you when they know you can't. When they find out that you can't walk.
I'll just tell them I don't go nowhere without my buddy here. You know what you gotta do, cowboy?
I'm scared. Where you going?
I gotta get a doctor.
No doctors, no cops.
You're sick, boy. You need a damn doctor.
Hey, just put me on a bus. I don't need you.
All right, now it's time to introduce my guest, Niles Schwartz. Welcome, Niles, and thanks for agreeing to be a guest on Cineversary.
I'm honored to have been asked and to be here. Happy birthday, Midnight Cowboy.
Yes, indeed. It is a birthday we are celebrating today and this month. Actually, Midnight Cowboy was released a little bit later in 1969, but no time like the present to celebrate the 50th birthday of this great classic film. So, Niles, when and where did you first see the movie, and how and why is it important to you?
It probably was in the 1990s on VHS, maybe while examining influential pictures of the new Hollywood on a whim from reading something like Mark Harris's Pictures of a Revolution, or something more sensationalistic like Peter Biskind's Easy Riders, Raging Bulls. Also, maybe I was just checking off my best picture winner list. It's I think it's become of increasing importance because of how it drapes itself in this watershed moment when Hollywood itself was at such a significant crossroads. The classical Hollywood model falling out of fashion and becoming antiquated, certainly with the broad social changes happening, and in the medium itself, in the medium of movies, and what was being represented and what filmmakers were able to represent. Really a powerful depiction of, I think, friendship and loneliness and pursuing an American dream, which is kind of illusory.
For my part, I first saw this movie about 14 years ago. So I moderate a film discussion group that meets weekly in the Chicagoland area, and one of our members had picked this movie for the group to see, and I was really impressed by the strong filmmaking and acting. And I have to say that my admiration only grows with each subsequent viewing. So Midnight Cowboy has certainly grown in stature, but I certainly never saw this when it first came out. I was a wee little one, and the whole cultural impact of it, and even the stature of it, which has grown among cinephiles and so forth, it had escaped me even in the 80s, 90s, and so forth. But again, within the past decade plus, I've really come to greatly admire Midnight Cowboy. So, Niles, why is this movie worth celebrating all these years later? Why, in your opinion, does it still matter, and how has it stood the test of time?
What's interesting to me is how culture itself is plastered over everything in Midnight Cowboy. We are, in 2019, saturated in televisual content, streaming everywhere, YouTube and reality television. And you look at Midnight Cowboy and you see things like that really vulgar talk show where the poodle is getting the makeup plastered all over its face, and it's really kind of disgusting. And yet, I think what it's saying, what John Schlesinger and Waldo Salt are saying in that moment, is that any kind of authentic or natural or essential identity, nature being the dog in that instance, is sort of obscured by something constructed, an air-sapped reality, much as the, say, Western movie iconography acts as a cloaking buffer for Joe Buck and what we understand through these really disturbing tacit flashbacks, which we infer is quite a traumatic set of experiences. Mm-hmm. And so the embrace and emulation of fiction, I think, is kind of a furtive flight from one's own personal history and the truth from where you really came from and who you really are, if you really are someone at all. And I think nowadays you could say that, there's a kind of idea that with the more we're saturated with images and streaming and so on and so forth, the more alienated we become. Midnight Cowboy conveys that 50 years ago in its own way. And at the same time, it's all about a relationship. It's a very relational story. What's interesting to me is that Waldo Salt, who was a blacklisted screenwriter, had spent many years working on a big adaptation of Don Quixote, by Cervantes.
That's right.
And like so many Quixotes, that movie never came to fruition. But I can't help looking at Midnight Cowboy, even though it's based on another book, and help but see Cervantes there. And in this sense, knight errantry of Cervantes has been replaced by John Wayne and the Hollywood Western. I mean, the movie begins with the sounds of classic Hollywood Westerns, and then pulling back from a drive-in movie theater screen. And then, you see Joe Buck, who has this completely affected personality he has his own costume, much as Alonso Quijana, their Don Quixote, has his own antiquated costume of sorts. Right. And in that sense, everyone's talking, like Nilsson is telling us, but no one's really talking to each other. And when Joe Buck meets Ratso Rizzo, Dustin Hoffman, who's a con man, that is to say, himself another actor of sorts, he's a perfect foil for Joe Buck. He becomes the Sancho Panza, I guess, on this journey. He's the earthy person versus Joe Buck's more preternatural Western iconographic emulation. Again, I think of, you look at the poster of Paul Newman in Joe Buck's apartment, the HUD, yeah. HUD, the title of the movie, of the fiction itself, is removed from it. It's just Paul Newman, which I think suggests that the iconography itself is more important than seeing a fiction for a fiction, which of course has to affect us as a viewer because we're watching a movie. And so the main idea, I think, of Midnight Cowboy, and the film is successful in generating this idea and this feeling, is to reflect upon ourselves and what we're watching. That's why it's important.
Wow, I'm aboard there with everything you said, and I thought that was really insightful, your Don Quixote reference there, which I never thought of before, but it's apropos. But yeah, for my take, I think this movie is a time capsule film that captures a specific place and time, New York City in the late 1960s, a city that, of course, is much different now, but which is depicted in a way that's fascinating 50 years later for what it represented, which is a soulless, dog-eat-dog metropolis where starry-eyed dreamers and the naive, they learn that the American dream is a fantasy, right? I think it still matters, Midnight Cowboy, primarily because of the fine direction by Schlesinger and, as we said, the memorable acting performances by Dustin Hoffman and Jon Voight. And it has to be said that the boundaries that it broke at the time, making it a pioneering movie that helped forever change American cinema. And I want to riff on this a bit more in just a little bit. But it's also stood the test of time because, in my opinion, it's a timeless tale, one about the shattering of illusions related to the American dream. You were kind of mentioning that earlier. It's also a story about two friends trying to survive in a harsh environment designed to destroy them. And it's a narrative about desperation and redemption. Niles, in what ways do you think Midnight Cowboy was influential on cinema and popular culture, or set trends in any way?
When I look at the movie, it's interesting how it's a collision of these different styles. Now, there is, of course, Western classic Hollywood there, and this was a United Artists production, I believe. But there's also, with Schlesinger, a background in British documentaries and British film, and with first-time cinematographer Adam Hollander, I think he was educated as part of the Czech New Wave. And so what you had with Hollander and Schlesinger let loose in New York, you had these more lightweight, furtively moving cameras that were not part of a typical Hollywood production. And it kind of incorporates more of a New Wave feel into this. What is really, it really is, I think, an accessible story, as jarring as it is, which is why it's so successful in a lot of ways. But you have that confluence of the European and the American coming together, and I think that really set the stage for what was to come. Now, of course, that, with Bonnie and Clyde in 1967, I mentioned Mark Harris's Pictures of a Revolution before. That sort of set the table for a movie like Midnight Cowboy. But I think it's emblematic of where things were going and how things were, of course, and beyond that, the acting styles, the new Hollywood acting style that you see with Dustin Hoffman and Jon Voight, and where they're really becoming those characters who themselves are characters. And what I mean by that, it's the kind of guy you look at and say, that guy's quite a character if you saw him in real life. And there are people like that in real life. That's the thing. And the grittiness of it. I mean, it's one of the most uncomfortable feeling movies that I could think of, with people are painted in sweat almost, yes. Especially Hoffman.
Oh, yeah, it's so true. But in addition to the sweat, you also feel the cold. I mean, recall the scenes where they're huddled in that tenement apartment and it's freezing outside. They're making soup over a burner pot, and I just feel shivering like they are. I feel cold. There's such a tangible effect that scenes like that have in the movie. So it has the ability to evoke the sweatiness, the griminess, the dirt, the anxiety, but it also, this film has a power to evoke the cold elements as well.
Yeah. And you bring up that's a good point. It's a movie of extremes like that. And again, that carries on into the cinematographic form, in terms of what camera Hollander and Schlesinger use. It goes from black and white to, I think it's the flashbacks are in really undersaturated, maybe even 16 millimeter. And then when the action moves to Florida, it's like a big advertisement. It's oversaturated. It's really clean looking. It's all over the place. And again, getting back to that Cervantian theme, it's a movie that's metatextually working us. It's bathing the viewer in the moviness of the movie, which I think has an effect on us. I mean, yeah. And you also make a good point with the New York story thing, because as a picture of New York, because those New York movies from the 60s, 70s, and even the 80s, that's a New York that doesn't exist anymore. It's really a bizarre time capsule for people that go to New York nowadays.
Right. As far as my answer to this question, in what ways do I think this film was influential on cinema or popular culture or set trends, Midnight Cowboy was extremely important as a film that helped break down the walls of censorship and offer adult content that was more realistic and graphic. I don't think we can overstate that. This is a pretty important movie in that whole cycle. But it, along with contemporary films like, as you mentioned, Bonnie and Clyde, there was also The Graduate, and from the same year, 1969, The Wild Bunch and Easy Rider, these all ushered in a new era of the young Hollywood maverick filmmaker, concurrently at a time when the old Hollywood studio system had collapsed. I want to read you something that actually former film critic of the Chicago Tribune, Michael Wilmington, wrote about this film, which I think is really appropriate to bring up now. He said, quote, "With its prestigious literary source, raw realism, nudity, profanity, on-screen, if discreetly staged, sex acts, near-documentary looks at Manhattan high and low life, plus a raft of cinematic tricks like flashbacks, fantasies, videos, shifts from monochrome to color, rifled from all the 60s art house hits of Italy and the French and Czech New Waves, Midnight Cowboy was an unabashed American art film. It was also a howitzer blast right through the remnants of the old Hollywood production code, which once forbade even inferences to deviant or extramarital sex. One by one, the movie seemed to shoot down taboos with effortless abandon, but not just for shock value." So Niles, let's dig deeper. What is the moral to the story here? What themes or messages are explored in Midnight Cowboy?
Well, if there is a theme that I think is most significant to Midnight Cowboy, it's the contrast between the construction of a self-image versus a relational need. That is to say, when throughout the whole movie, Joe Buck is looking at himself in the mirror and talking to himself. And at the end, Joe Buck is looking out the window and the whole world is reflected on him. And he's holding Ratso Rizzo, who's now passed away, in his arms. And it's a very, it's moving outside of yourself. And the movie is, as far as I could see, really about people crowded together. That's why the long lenses on New York streets are so effective, because people are flattened together at the same time, so detached from each other. With that, you go to New York and it's such a pulsating, electrifying, alive place, and that sense has not changed over the 50 years, I think. I love going there. But a big lesson here, the crime rate is much lower nowadays, but everything still costs money. And Midnight Cowboy, that is accentuated everywhere with the money, MONY bank that Joe Buck can see from his apartment to the, he has to pay to use the TV and everything, and passing Tiffany, and then there's a guy who passed out or might be dead in front of Tiffany and Company of New York, and Joe Buck is the only one who stops to take a look at the dude. A problem that some people have with Midnight Cowboy, I think, or they had with it in 1969, was that it wasn't more didactic, that it wasn't more moral about social issues happening at the time, like the Vietnam War, but that stuff is certainly there in the background on television. I always defer to what the great critic Northrop Frye said, that a great artist isn't heard, they're overheard. And I think Midnight Cowboy just has all the discontent of 1968 and 69 flowing through the whole thing, but it doesn't hit you on the face with it. You absorb it.
Yeah, I would definitely agree, Niles, but I would say that you're still getting into the vibe of the counterculture here. You're still tapping into the pulse of what was going on in the late 60s and the disenfranchisement, the disillusion, the alienation, the isolation that a lot of folks, younger folks, were feeling. And I think that that's no small point there with Midnight Cowboy. Other messages and themes of the movie that I wanted to explore. One is, well, first you need a hell of a lot more than sunshine and coconut milk to sustain life, right? So, and of course, crackers and ketchup will only get you so far. Had to get that out of the way. But I think this film asks an important question. What does it mean to be a man? So think about Joe. He's enraptured by a stereotype of male masculinity, that of the rugged, strong, and macho cowboy, an archetypal character created by the movies that probably never existed. You got to wonder if maybe Philip Morris had second thoughts about their Marlboro Man ads after this movie came out, right? But living a life of illusion or fantasy is another theme prevalent in Midnight Cowboy. Both Joe and Ratso believe they are good at what they do, respectively being a male gigolo and a symbol of attractive masculinity, and being a smart and successful pimp and street hustler. But the truth is, they are both terrible at their jobs. Another theme, you already talked about this earlier, is the myth of the American dream. Joe thinks he can score big by playing the part of a cowboy stud in New York City, and Ratso believes that sunny Florida is the land of milk and honey. Both, of course, are disappointed. The power of friendship is another message here, and how losing a friend can leave a hole in your life. This film is, in a way, a buddy picture and a profile of two oddball characters whose friendship helps fill the emptiness in each of their lives. I want you to consider how Joe loses his first friend we see in traumatic fashion. This is a girlfriend, which helps prompt him to leave Texas. And then think about how the prospect of losing another friend, Ratso, serves as the catalyst for him leaving, in this case, New York. Midnight Cowboy to me is also a journey to redemption. Now, Joe sinks to a new low after resorting to sudden violence with one of his clients, and that signals the degree to which his illusions and the urban jungle he lives in have turned him into this soulless animal capable of violence. And yet by the end of the film, he redeems himself and chooses a path of compassion and dignity by caring for his dying friend and stripping away the artifice of his former life. We see him literally throw away his cowboy getup, right? Consider how Joe's life comes full circle, too. He starts the movie on a bus ride to what he thinks is the promised land, and he ends the film on another bus ride toward an unknown future. But perhaps this is a future unencumbered by the pretense of fantasy and role-playing. Loneliness and alienation are other obvious themes at work here. So few films before or since depict, in my opinion, with such ruthless and cold realism, the estrangement felt by such a sympathetic main character. You mentioned before that Nilsson song, Everybody's Talking at Me, which speaks to the lack of communication or regard for our fellow man and the world's inability for two-way communication. So the lyrics go, everybody's talking at me, I don't hear a word they're saying, only the echoes of my mind. And that speaks to how easily we tune out the world around us. I want you to think, too, about how Ratso, in that famous scene, is almost hit by a car, but insists that the driver pay attention to him. And that, of course, triggers the most quotable line from the movie, I'm walking here.
Yeah, people not paying attention to each other because they think they're the only person on the planet. And that's central to Joe Buck, by the way. You know, he wants, Crazy Annie loves Joe. He's the one. He's the only one. And I always see a religious theme, kind of, you know, Florida being heaven, and the engulfment of iconography that goes from not just advertisements of Florida, but or comic books and John Wayne, but also the Christ imagery surrounding everything. You know, and Rizzo sets Joe up to meet that him. It's a baptism. It's a mock baptism. It's like a black mass baptism. He runs into this religious zealot living somewhere, I think, on the Lower East Side.
With his electric Jesus figure.
Yeah. I mean, there's something definitely, I think, funny about that and dark about it, but I think structurally it's significant. That's a baptism for Joe Buck, his baptism into New York, because after that he's sort of wised who Ratso Rizzo is. And, you know, at the end of the journey, as you say, he gets rid of the costume. There's an enlightenment. There's a desengano, seeing beyond himself. So, two characters, one of whom is pointedly unlovable, the other being so naive as to be unlovable. The radio, I think, is also, that gets into the whole medium thing. Everyone's talking and no one's listening. Joe Buck just has his radio, the medium that he's always listening to, and when he gets rid of that, he's naked in a way.
Well, yeah, and I also think that radio represents how lonely he is and how it's become his only friend, and how ironic it is that he has to pawn it away for a few bucks.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've ever been in that position in life where you really are counting your nickels and pennies, and it's this movie, I think, more than anything captures that feeling. Joe Buck looking at the guy in the diner just flipping eggs, and John Voight is so good here in making us crave those crackers.
Yeah, but then to add insult to injury, he can't even enjoy a ketchup and cracker sandwich. The ketchup just splatters all over his lap.
I always interpret that as like a mock castration, by the way. And right after that, that so-called castration, that's when he looks in the mirror at the subway and says, talks to himself. He knows what he has to do. And that's when he ends up with Bob Balaban in the theater. He finds a homosexual client, a John, which in that situation doesn't go pleasant for him either. Nothing works out for this guy. So many little defeats.
No, absolutely not. You could say nothing really works out until he meets Ratso. And of course, it's ironic that Ratso becomes his good friend, but he dies by the end of the movie. And this is after Joe has learned to let go of his illusions and get rid of the cowboy outfit, etc. Ratso's no longer there, and so there's an uncertain future. And that begs the question, how do you feel about the movie by the end? This is an ambiguous resolution, or lack thereof, of any resolution. But it's uncertain, and you could look at it as an optimistic or a pessimistic conclusion to the movie. I asked my film discussion viewers, and it seemed like the group was split. Half felt kind of optimistic or positive about Joe's future, perhaps, and the other half, boy, they really weren't so sure, and they felt it was more of a downbeat kind of ending. What'd you think?
I don't side either way in that sense. I don't see it as being necessarily pessimistic or optimistic. It sounds like an insufferably zen answer, but it is what it is. Mm-hmm. The thing is that it is a disillusioned ending as I see it. And I think that a breakthrough has come on that journey. And, you could argue on a wider scale that America is sort of going 60, a kind of awakening to things that aren't so rosy and glossy and John Wayne-like necessarily. How things end up, that doesn't matter. What does matter is opening up to other people. Who's to say maybe that feeling will be fleeting and Joe Buck will, I don't know, become Disco Joe in a few years. But in that moment, I think it's a life-affirming conclusion.
I would agree.
That makes sense. None of those themes would work if Schlesinger didn't construct his film with so many formal textures, like the lenses and the film stocks, as if the elements constructing this thing we call a movie was as alive as the actors. Mm-hmm. The chase into the subway, shifting from the 35 millimeter color to the black and white, using nice high key lighting and then having no key lighting. And then, back to the Warhol party where when John Voight goes into that dark room, he almost seems to disappear into the pure color, the saturation of red. He's almost becoming an abstraction, becoming one with the emulsion of the film print itself.
Niles, who do you think this film appealed to initially when it was released in 1969, and who do you think Midnight Cowboy appeals to today? And, bonus credit here, if that appeal has changed, what does it say about the film's impact, influence, and legacy?
I think it appealed to the counterculture in 1969, at least I want to believe that. But at the same time, I mentioned that it's an accessible movie, it's a moving movie, and watching some of the documentaries on the new Criterion Blu-ray, the sense I got was that audiences who saw it in large quantities, which would, I'm presumably meaning middle-class American audiences, go to see this, and they were moved by it. They wept while watching it. It was a hit. Even though it was X-rated, it won Best Picture, and the moment it won Best Picture, the MPAA was like, okay, we'll change it to an R. I think it had a very wide appeal in 1969. Nowadays, I don't know that Midnight Cowboy has that much appeal for a lot of viewers, even though its themes of money and, as I said, entertainment are as pressing as ever. The vacuousness of both money and movies or entertainment, searching for the American dream. It is a product of its time in the sense that America was undergoing this self-appraisal and revelation and revolution. And nowadays, I don't know. I think Midnight Cowboy is a movie that's overheard more than it's heard, if that makes sense.
All right, let's shift gears at this point and actually go back to something we were talking about earlier, Niles, which is dated elements from Midnight Cowboy. If I can go first, I would say, in echo to our earlier discussion, that Andy Warhol-esque trippy party that they attend, as well as the avant-garde editing style, like the quickly alternating shots of Joe walking through Times Square at night, and then in color, the often disturbing flashbacks. These are all relics and psychedelic trappings of a more experimental time in movies. They're artifacts of the late 60s that, let's face it, may not have aged so gracefully. But as far as pop culture artifacts, in addition to that, I haven't had anyone invite me over to their crib to play scribbage anytime lately either. But as far as what has aged well, I would say the fantastic performances, the gritty variete-style realism of New York captured on film, and also what is communicated between Joe and Ratso without words or unnecessary exposition. I think that really speaks to the power of the film, the nonverbal communication. Niles, what are your 2 cents here?
Well, as I said, the drug party definitely looks like an antiquated anomaly in the whole picture. I love it, by the way, but you watch that sequence, and with the music and the color and everything, it looks what we would now call as a pastiche of the time. Kind of it could almost be making fun of it. I think it represents, in the function of that story, going into the underworld, so to speak. Joe and Ratso are in this almost supernatural place, this sort of Walpurgisnacht kind of area where the other people are supernatural almost. They're not on planet Earth. And maybe the sexual politics. Well, certainly, I think any movie from that time, think about the sexual politics, and people will have problems with it.
All right, this is a birthday celebration after all, and birthdays are all about getting presents, except it's the fans who continue to get the gifts. So what is this film's greatest gift to viewers, Niles?
Probably the performances of Hoffman and Voight. Few performances are so alive, and the fact that it's more than one great character, it's 2, and they're pushing each other to do their best, and it's something that you can't take your eyes off.
Yeah, I totally agree. You could make a case that this is each of their finest hour, 2 of the greatest roles and performances in Jon Voight and Dustin Hoffman's careers.
Right. And, of course, Jon Voight had several great performances after this. Dustin Hoffman had several great performances after this. But you could make an argument that this is, for both of them, their best work. And the fact that they're doing it together is not of any insignificance.
For my take, I think Midnight Cowboy's greatest gift is that it's a reminder of the power of friendship and proof of the axiom that opposites attract. To me, Midnight Cowboy itself is the kind of gift that keeps on giving because it isn't predictable. It's not formulaic or pandering. Here's a picture that isn't afraid to be downbeat or depressing or unresolved at its conclusion. Enigmatic in that it doesn't have to tell us everything we may want to know about Joe and Ratso. It leaves some things to the imagination.
Absolutely.
All right, we're getting near the end here. Niles, do you think this movie will still be widely watched and considered relevant in another 50 years? Why or why not?
Well, as a cinephile, this is something I worry about for all significant movies, and not just in terms of restoration and preservation, but I really wonder about audiences are even going to be curious to check out a movie like this, which is such a staple of its time. So assuming that a strong sense of artistic appreciation and humanism endures into the future, then I'm going to say probably, but I don't know. I'm kind of pessimistic about things in general. So.
Yeah, I got to agree with you to a big extent there. This will be a hard sell, I imagine, for folks in 2069 and beyond to take as seriously as they did in 1969. Big city life, of course, has changed so much already, and while male prostitutes and street hustlers, of course, still exist, 1969-era New York City will probably seem like an ancient civilization from a distant planet to movie watchers 5 decades from now. But, then again, we're still watching period piece movies and time capsule films today from decades ago, so I hope I'm wrong. You could argue that Midnight Cowboy will age better than many other older films because it's more adult. It's a color film. It's gritty and dirty and dark tonally, and its themes and characters are strong.
Right. I think that the foil for Midnight Cowboy is that it might come across as more of a cultural artifact than a vibrant work of art. So I think something like, say, 2001: A Space Odyssey or The Godfather, for example, those probably will endure, but they kind of transcend the artifact element, the times in which they're made. Not to say that Midnight Cowboy of its own virtues doesn't, but at the same time, I don't think as brilliantly.
All right, Niles, what are you currently working on that listeners should check out?
I write and review movies and Blu-ray for Slant Magazine at slant.com, and I also have a website, the MSP Cinephiles.org, where you can see a lot of my writing, and my book, Off the Map, Freedom, Control, and the Future in Michael Mann's Public Enemies, is available from Cascade Books, and you can get it on Amazon for a pretty good price.
Terrific. Well, we'll be sure to check those out, including your Blu-ray reviews. Actually, that's the way I first learned of you. I read your fantastic review and write-up on Midnight Cowboy and the Criterion Collection Blu-rays, so kudos to you for your work on Slant. We appreciate you taking the time and being a guest here on Cineversary. So, Niles, thanks again, and happy birthday, Midnight Cowboy.
Happy birthday, Midnight Cowboys. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, that was my conversation with Niles Schwartz. I thank him again for agreeing to appear on this podcast. Now it's time for Standing Ovations. This is where I give a shout out to a movie, book, website, TV program, podcast, or other work that I think would be of interest to classic film lovers. My standing ovation for January, it's a book. It's called Conversations with the Great Movie Makers of Hollywood's Golden Age at the American Film Institute. It's edited by George Stevens, Jr. He's the son of the famous director George Stevens. And it features fascinating interviews with master movie makers, including Howard Hawks, Fritz Lang, David Lean, Hal Wallace, Ray Bradbury, Federico Fellini, Ingmar Bergman, Elia Kazan, Alfred Hitchcock, and so many more. Now, this is a pretty thick book, folks, at over 700 pages, but if you're a cinephile like me, you won't have any trouble taking the time to savor all the captivating insights, anecdotes, reflections, and tricks of the trade shared by these esteemed filmmakers. I also want to recommend that you check out a website, cineversegroup.blogspot.com. That's my portal for the Cineverse Film Discussion Group that I launched 13 years ago and which continues to meet weekly in the South Suburban Chicago area. We're a democratic film society that watches and then discusses a predetermined movie that our members pick on a rotating basis. At cineversegroup.blogspot.com, and Cineverse is spelled Cineverse, you can hear podcast recordings of our group discussions and read more about the films we study. The reason I created Cineverse, and this podcast you're listening to for that matter, is to foster an appreciation for an intelligent dialogue about memorable films. To me, watching a movie is fun, of course, we can all agree, but interpreting it, talking about it, sharing opinions and theories about it, that's even more enjoyable. I find the real pleasure is in digging deeper to learn how and why a film was made, the impact it's had on culture, society, and other movies, why that movie has the power to evoke a strong emotional reaction in each of us, and what it can teach us today. We also have a Cineversary podcast Facebook page at facebook.com/CineversaryPodcast. You can go there for more information on current or future episodes. You can post a comment or a suggestion there for a memorable movie about to celebrate a major anniversary that maybe you think would be worthy of an episode of this podcast. And if you do go there, please like us on Facebook too. If you'd like to email me a comment or a suggestion, you can get a hold of me, Erik Martin, at cineversegroup@gmail.com. Also, please spread the good word about this show to your kith and kin. And if you like this podcast, hey, leave us good reviews on whatever platform you hear it from, especially iTunes. We greatly appreciate that. finally, make plans to check out our February episode of Cineversary. That's when we'll commemorate the 60th anniversary of the film ranked as the greatest comedy of all time, Some Like It Hot, which made its debut back in 1959. This has been your humble host, Erik Martin, reminding you to butter up that popcorn, live a big screen surround sound life, and cherish those classic movies because truth is, they're not getting older, folks. They're just getting better. Thanks again for giving us a listen.